every child matters in life and in death.
Kimberly Murray says many Indigenous children who died and were buried at residential schools aren't missing, but disappeared. That means they were victims of enforced disappearance, which she explained is a crime against humanity under international law. Murray is the special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked burials at residential schools. She was appointed by the federal government to provide legal advice on how to deal with these sites. She presented her much-anticipated final report in a special ceremony to survivors here in Gatineau, Quebec. She was joined on stage by an empty chair representing those kids who never came home and a semicircle of Indigenous cradle boards representing what was lost at residential schools.
The forced removal and transfer of Indigenous children was Canadian law and Canadian policy. Those in charge of these institutions knew that the children's chances of surviving were low. They exposed the children to diseases that killed them, refused to provide them with enough food, and permitted non-consensual human experimentation to be conducted on them. Pursuant to international legal criteria, the enforced disappearance of children requires the government to ensure that full investigations into the deaths of the children occur.
Murray laid out a comprehensive plan to achieve what she called an Indigenous-led reparations framework, but she didn't provide recommendations, explaining that governments typically ignore recommendations in a report like this. Instead, she provided a list of 42 moral, ethical, and legal obligations she says all governments are obliged to uphold. In her conclusion, she writes, Canada, as the perpetrator of atrocity crimes and mass human rights breaches, cannot investigate itself. To do so creates a fundamental conflict that is unacceptable to Indigenous peoples. She's calling for compensation for families, an apology, the establishment of an Indigenous-led commission of investigation, guaranteed access to records, a moratorium on the destruction of records, and enactment of legislation that she says would provide access to the truth, among many other things. Justice Minister and Attorney General Arif Irani was here in Ottawa to accept the final report.
While today's gathering marks a closure in some ways, it is by no means an ending. It is a milestone, instead, in our ongoing efforts to address the intergenerational trauma of residential schools.
The question now is this. Is the minister prepared to accept that Indigenous children who died at residential schools were victims of crimes against humanity and mass human rights violations? And if so, is the government prepared to uphold those obligations that Murray lays out? I'm Brett Forster for CBC Indigenous in Gatineau, Quebec.
I want to hear a round of applause for her.